Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. In this episode we're going to be talking about state-sanctioned terrorism, especially as it relates to an interesting figure given today's events known as Tedros Adhanom. The current director of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, has been directly implicated by numerous sources as having some involvement with genocide and state terrorism. So the way I'm going to go about this is we're going to sort of begin at the end where we are right now and then work back from the beginning. Here's an article from Al Jazeera, Torture, State Terrorism, and Ethiopia's Transformation. So they have a new prime minister, which represents a major shift in the internal power politics within Ethiopia, and he is the first person to ever admit what the rest of the world actually knew for quite some time already. So in this article, they get into an aspect here where the new prime minister began to talk about those issues. It says here, quote, in his response, the prime minister offered an honest, awe-inspiring, and highly robust defense of his administration's transformational decisions. While all of Ahmed's policy statements were clear, detailed, and nuanced, it was his astonishing admission of state terrorism and torture that signaled a new dawn for the country and the continent. And you find out further down in the article that this has been due to a conflict between the new PM's party known as the EPRDF versus the TPLF, or Tigray People's Liberation Front. Now, the TPLF was the party of Dr. Tedros. They were a minority party that has been in the rulership position for a very long time. They dominated Ethiopian politics for almost the last 30 years, and they were highly, highly discriminatory against the larger majority populations within Ethiopia, which makes many of Dr. Tedros' positions very ironic, considering he says that he's for universal health care. However, he did not offer that to the majority populations within Ethiopia. Indeed, he specifically denied medical care to many of them, and thousands of them, some say even millions of them, disappeared or died due to Dr. Tedros' actions and inactions. As I move down here a bit further into the article, it says that the new PM's agenda is indeed a transformational one, and we can only hope so for the sake of the Ethiopian people. So I'm going to move from there to the primary text that we have here, which is from roughestimate.org, The Crimes of Tedros Adhanom, by John Martin. The WHO's Tedros Adhanom should be put on trial for crimes against humanity. And in this, you're going to find out that the global scale of corruption is just absolutely immense. And you'll see the numerous connections that this guy has, Dr. Tedros, to, of course, Bill Gates and Dr. Fauci and the Chinese dictator Xi Jinping. And it seems over and over again lately what we see is all roads lead to China, or in other cases to Jeffrey Epstein. So I'll open up here with the beginning of the article. Tedros Adhanom. So I begin here with the start of the article. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, as well as being the first WHO director without a medical degree, also has a somewhat political background compared to his predecessors. On his online biography, the WHO lays out his qualifications as Ethiopian Minister of Health from 2002 to 2012. Impressive stuff. Of course, you'll note here that he has this lack of a medical degree also in common with Bill Gates, who runs around lecturing the rest of the world as to what they're supposed to do because he says so and he has a lot of money. And in the second paragraph here, what you find out is the organization that Tedros belonged to, the TPLF, was founded as a communist revolutionary party, and you'll see almost everything that they did is really rooted in 1960s style communist revolutionary ideas, the ideas of using violence in order to take over places. In the third paragraph here, you find out about how this was ethnic minority rule. It says, quote, over time, the TPLF began to exert more and more influence over the other two parties. Most military generals and key leaders within the government are Tigray, including the prime minister who ruled the country for 21 years before his death. The Tigray represent only 6% of the population of Ethiopia. One of the major ethnic groups are the Amhara, who mostly made up the Mengistu regime. And of course, it's these Amhara peoples who were treated absolutely horribly by Dr. Tedros. And as they point out here, you can go back to the beginnings of the TPLF, to which Dr. Tedros belonged. And as it said in their 1968 manifesto, the Amhara people they called their eternal enemy. And of course, a number of terror databases list the TPLF as a terror organization, even prior to this new prime minister actually coming out and admitting that that is exactly what they had been involved in. And we see further down in this article here how Dr. Tedros was involved in various cover-ups of cholera epidemics or cholera outbreaks that took place within Ethiopia, which he would falsely mislabel as acute watery diarrhea. In one of the sessions at the Ethiopian parliament, around 2 million Amhara people were found to have, quote, disappeared from the population census. This is all under the watch of Dr. Tedros. And as we can also see here, Dr. Tedros was listed as the third most important person within their standing committees. And indeed, this paragraph here is key. Quote, the Amhara people have reported systematic discrimination and human rights abuses by the current government. That was the previous government, actually. Human Rights Watch in 2010 wrote a report on how aid in the form of food and fertilizer was withheld from local Amhara villagers because of their affiliations with the opposition party. Other forms of aid denial involved the refusal of emergency health care by Ministry of Health workers, the same ministry which was at the time being led by one Tedros Adhanom. A bit further down in this piece, they talk about the famines which hit Ethiopia during the 1980s, where some 8.6 million people. And a bit further down here, we see a discussion of the famines which struck Ethiopia in the 1980s. And indeed, due to Dr. Tedros' subservience to the Chinese communists, millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death now. This is even admitted by the UN. And then we have another critical portion here. After his shining accomplishments in health, shining accomplishments, Tedros had bigger fish to fry. In 2012, he was appointed foreign minister, and there quickly followed a crackdown on journalists and government opponents in the country. And all of this, of course, is forgotten and covered up by our own media today. And here we can even see where he was involved in lying about a British citizen. One such case was a British citizen, Andy Taseig, who was arrested at Sana'a airport and twice given a death sentence in Ethiopia. This led to the involvement of the British government, who threatened denial of aid to Ethiopia unless he be granted asylum. Dr. Tedros responded that Taseig was, quote, being treated very well. He even has a laptop. Have you ever heard of a political prisoner with a laptop? Andy, of course, after his return to the UK, told a somewhat different story of being tortured for days on end, alongside dozens of other prisoners. A bit later on, we see here that Dr. Tedros was also involved in the forced relocation of some 15,000 people. And for anyone who happened to be upset about that, the police responded at first with tear gas and then later with mass shootings. The violence and resulting stampede killed an estimated 500 people, according to Human Rights Watch. The government then issued a state of emergency, arresting an estimated 70,000 people and forced dozens of opposition journalists into exile. And we find out a bit further down in this that Dr. Tedros, of course, loved another bloodthirsty, violent dictator, Robert Mugabe. Tedros was so insane that he actually nominated Mugabe as a, quote, goodwill ambassador to the WHO. Now recall that Mugabe, of course, stole the lands of many Boer farmers and ordered the killings of some 20,000 people in Zimbabwe. And we can see here a little further down that Ethiopia scored a 19 out of 100 on the Human Freedom Index. But predictably, their party was able to win elections, sometimes by 100% of the vote. Obviously, nothing fishy going on there at all. And then what is it we find out here that's really interesting about the WHO? It talks about how the WHO had been riddled with scandal after scandal, and it was faced with almost no rise in budgets. But then what began to happen? Big Pharma started to take over the WHO. It says here that they turned towards the corporate sector for an additional set of funding, and by 2008, corporate donations made up 80% of the organization's budget. And it says here the role that large drug companies played in shaping global health policy created a serious conflict of interest, which of course doesn't seem to concern anyone in the media, because the media is also highly funded by Big Pharma. And then, alas, we come to the ubiquitous Bill Gates. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation played a large role in promoting Tedros. After their large investments into healthcare programs in Ethiopia, which Tedros had facilitated, the foundation was keen to promote similar programs on a global level and donated billions to the WHO towards this end. So he has an extensive and long-running relationship with Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And predictably, the mainstream media played their role, as they always do. The media, and I quote here, "The media, of course, portrayed Dr. Tedros as a saintly figure on a moral mission to cure the world of deadly diseases." He's done a great job of that, right? A Twitter campaign slogan ran with, "It's time for an African to lead the WHO." Of course, they have to pick one who's immensely corrupt, which is, of course, not good at all. Indeed, one only wishes it hadn't been an African in a regime that had spent the last few years killing and resettling more Africans than almost any other country. And they come down here to discuss the aspect of how China told the WHO to delay in naming it a pandemic, and they waited to do so after it had infected some 140 countries, which, as it points out, was 70 more than it took for the swine flu to be declared a pandemic. And the author of the article calls for the prosecution of Tedros at the International Criminal Court, but of course that wouldn't be any good either, because that's just another corrupt globalist institution, and it would go nowhere and do nothing whatsoever, just like the UN and just like the EU. And I'll go from there to an article in Health Impact News. Is WHO Director Tedros a terrorist? Global ties to Bill Gates, Clinton Foundation, Dr. Fauci, China, and genocide. And here, of course, we see him in photographs with the list of usual suspects. And we have Dr. Fauci here, of course, sidling up next to him and constantly praising him, with, of course, no reference whatsoever to all of his horrendous actions that he took in Ethiopia. This article actually took a screenshot from the Global Terrorism Database, and what it ultimately shows here is that the TPLF, Dr. Tedros's organization, was responsible for a series of kidnappings, bombings, and armed robberies. The stuff of leftist dreams, of course. There's an interesting section here called Human Rights Organizations Repeated Alarms. Amnesty International denounced its political violence for decades. A report published in international law journals claimed that in spite of efforts to disguise its dictatorship, the TPFL was actually, quote, abusing the notions of self-determination and democracy to plunder Ethiopia. And we'll take a look at one of those articles later. This was also the alarm raised by a document of the Oakland Institute, which estimated that the $3.5 billion in aid funds received by Ethiopia, 60% of the national budget, were mainly used for political repression. And this was again confirmed by Human Rights Watch, who accused the European Parliament in 2016 of overlooking the numerous violations committed by the Ethiopian regime. And then we have the coup de grace here with the genocide accusations, and I quote, "That illusion quickly fades away when one discovers the damning dossier presented by the Amhara Professional Union, the APU, accusing him of having carried out a real genocidal policy as Ethiopia's Minister of Health. Indeed, the Amhara ethnic group lost more than 2.5 million people between the 1997 and 2007 censuses. While the other major ethnic groups grew by a yearly average of 2.6%, the Amharas had a slower population increase, with only 1.9%. They did not benefit from the same health services and were not allocated equal resources as the dominating Tigray population, except for one program, a contraceptive campaign, for which the Amhara appeared to have been on the top of the list. The Tigray population had 5 times better health coverage in terms of infrastructure and number of healthcare providers." So this is indeed his idea of how universal healthcare would look around the world. Then there's an entire section here on how it seems that millions or perhaps even billions of dollars in grants and various funds made to organizations under the control of Dr. Tedros seem to go missing. And indeed, as they investigated it, they found that there was, quote, a flagrant lack of transparency. And then we come down to this very interesting section where the WHO election was backed by Bill Gates and China. So, of course, Dr. Tedros connected to Bill Gates and Fauci and the dictator Xi Jinping. And you can look for yourself at this article and see the various interests involved and in what direction that seems to go. And wherever you find Bill Gates, you find vaccines at the top of the list, and contraception and abortion and various other population control methods. And we have another interesting section down here under a part called Meet the World's Most Powerful Doctor, Bill Gates. And it says, I quote, "But also China has made huge investments in Ethiopia." It's sort of one of their wedge countries that they're using to get into Africa overall and manipulate and control the entire continent. The Chinese have developed nearly 70% of the Ethiopian infrastructure and are financing the construction of the headquarters of the future African Center for Disease Prevention and Control. For its part, Ethiopia occupies a strategic position as it is the gateway to the African continent when coming from the east. No wonder that in March 2017, 2 months ahead of the WHO election, Dr. Tedros was invited to deliver a keynote speech at the Beijing University. So this guy is just a through and through communist, and he is completely loyal to any and all communist causes, and especially the great leaders of the communists around the world right now, the Chi-Coms. And here is a photograph from that presentation. And not surprisingly, Bill Gates also took part in the same event. And China could also have other motives for trying to get entry into Africa. As it says here, the Financial Times quoted an official of the U.S. administration, quote, "It's a threat to Africa. Africa has vast amounts of genomic data, and the Chinese want to build the CDC to eventually steal the data from all the other centers," referring to 5 regional Africa CDC hubs. They handle high-risk viruses, health crises, research, and data collection. But my guess is they would also want access to the most varied genomes on the planet, which of course are in Africa. And I'll move from there to pointing out this School of Law article, Case Western Reserve, Journal of International Law. This is from 2004 by Matthew McCracken. Abusing Self-Determination and Democracy, How the TPLF is Looting Ethiopia. And this article is far too long for this particular video. You can check it out for yourself, but some of the things that it points out inside are the numerous human rights violations that took place, of course, directly under the watch of Dr. Tedros. There were numerous murders which took place. There were the formation of various concentration camps. There was torture that was going on. There were voters who were actually murdered during elections, and a whole list of various ways that they committed war crimes against rural peasants, and the employment of human minesweepers. They would send out ordinary people with no education, no knowledge, no background in how to do this whatsoever, and they would have them search for mines, and of course lots of these people were blown to pieces. And this article is also quite in-depth, and it actually gets into the various methods that were used in order to suppress the minority rights. And that was, of course, led by the TPLF, the organization of Dr. Tedros. And finally, we can take a look here at part of the conclusion where the author states that the TPLF has attempted to loot Ethiopia from within. The TPLF and its political sibling, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, have perpetrated a grand fraud on the Ethiopian people and the international community. As the preceding analysis shows, circumstantial evidence of the TPLF's hidden agenda abounds. The TPLF has established a facade of democracy. And of course, the author of that article is on the political left, so this is not simply a right-wing versus left-wing thing. And that is really pointed up here by this article from Counterpunch, which is, of course, no friend at all of the right. It's actually a very partisan far-left group. And we can see this article here from Thomas Mountain, the gangster head of the WHO. In this, you find out how the Bill Gates Foundation is deeply nested in Ethiopian politics, and has indeed issued some 135 grants there. You also see that Dr. Tedros was involved in the misappropriation of health funds repeatedly. The opening of the article starts here. The head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, was a senior capo for the Tigray People's Liberation Front gangster mafia that ruled Ethiopia from 1991 to 2018. During that time, he served as health minister and foreign minister, cementing his credentials as a member of the inner circle of what was one of, if not the most corrupt, brutal, and genocidal regimes to set foot on this planet in the past 30 years. From 2007 to Ethiopia's peaceful revolution in 2018, Dr. Tedros was complicit in the TPLF's crime of genocide against the Somali people of the Ogaden, with a genocidal blockade of food and medicine to the region. He was part of expelling the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders from the Ogaden during a series of cholera outbreaks and in helping deny medicine to the Somali Ogaden. He oversaw the deaths of untold thousands during a series of historical droughts, famines, and epidemics. Dr. Tedros did not just cover up cholera epidemics, he was complicit in a medicine blockade to those affected. And the author of this article from Counterpunch here points to the CIA having involvement, and of course he says here that it was during 2016 that a lot of this took place, and of course the president during that time was none other than Obama. And I'll go from there to another one. Another article, WHO director was a top member of violent Ethiopian Communist Party. And then he gets into some of the details here that we've already been discussing. Here's another article from Fox News. WHO chief's questionable past comes into focus following coronavirus response. Here's one from The Hill. China and the WHO's chief hold them both accountable for this pandemic. And as we move down in this article, it shows here, quote, from the outset, Dr. Tedros has defended China despite its gross mismanagement of the highly contagious disease. When President Trump took a critical step to stop the coronavirus at U.S. borders by issuing a travel ban as early as January 31st, Dr. Tedros said widespread travel bans and restrictions were not needed to stop the outbreak and could have the effect of increasing fear and stigma with little public health benefit. Here's an earlier article from the Anti-Corruption Digest, Why Dr. Tedros Should Not Lead the World Health Organization. And it gets into many of the same criticisms that you've heard already. Here's another article that says Dr. Tedros likes to play the race card again and again and again. So this is one of the ways that he avoids criticism is by simply saying that his opponents are racist. And finally here, a wrap-up article from Al Jazeera. Ethiopia's Tedros becomes first African to head the WHO. Then it talks about some of the controversies and how he was actually involved in forced sterilizations and forced vaccinations in the past, along with the terrorism and possible genocidal behavior. And remember, of course, this guy is directly connected to the Chinese communists and Bill Gates. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.